everyone. Welcome to the last substantive panel of the summit. It is titled Bitcoin and the Rules, Policy, Regulation, and What is Actually Happening. I will be moderating, and I'll be joined with panelists Haley Lennon and Lauren Rodriguez. Joanna couldn't join us, but we have a great session prepared for you guys. This objective of this session is going to be to provide a clear, practical overview of how law and regulation affect Bitcoin without any alarmism or political spin. So we're going to focus on how regulation actually works, what has materially changed in the last 12 to 18 months, what individuals should understand, what businesses should be tracking, and how to stay informed without fear. The goal here is clarity. And guys, we're going to be taking questions from the audience at the end. So please feel free to click that Q&A tab on the right, and you can ask questions and upvote ones you'd like to hear from us. So let's bring everyone else to the main stage and join me up here. Hi, Lauren. Hi, Haley. I will go first to introduce myself to the audience, and then I will have the other panelists introduce themselves as well. So it is great to be here. I am a partner at Nelson Mullins. I represent companies operating in the Bitcoin mining and the digital infrastructure space. My practice is really focused on high-stakes litigation and regulatory disputes. And a significant part of my work has involved issues that arise with Bitcoin mining, energy markets, and when local governance intersects. Over the past couple of years, I've represented mining operators in disputes ranging from all types of litigation, a myriad of disputes. And so it's really given me this front row seat to Bitcoin, how it's being integrated into existing legal and energy frameworks. In addition to my legal practice, I also serve as a special legal advisor to Ion Strategies, a digital asset investment firm focused on long-term role of Bitcoin in the global markets. So my perspective today comes from working directly with companies building in this space and navigating the legal frameworks around it. I'll have Lauren go ahead and please introduce yourself. She brings a very personal perspective to this conversation. Her family has been directly impacted by one of the most high-profile enforcement cases involving Bitcoin privacy tools. So please, Lauren, introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you. Like you said, my name's Lauren Rodriguez. The reason I'm on this panel is because my husband is currently serving a 5-year federal prison sentence for his development work on Bitcoin. I don't bring quite the knowledge that either of my fellow panelists do, but I hope I can share some insight that's a little bit different.
Absolutely. Yeah, you'll provide a lot of value, I know. And Haley, she doesn't need much of an introduction because she's already well known as a seasoned and veteran regulatory attorney in this space. But please, for the newcomers, Haley, introduce us and give us a little bit about you and your background.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this panel and hearing your perspective, Lauren. I think it's an important one to have. I've been an attorney in the crypto and Bitcoin space since about 2015. I first joined as in-house counsel at Silvergate Bank, which was one of the first crypto-friendly banking partners in the United States. I've been in-house at a variety of exchanges, including Bitflyer, Coinbase, and most recently Fold. And I was also prior to Fold for 4 years, partner at Brown Rudnick, where all my clients were crypto and Bitcoin related companies. So I focus primarily on regulatory, which I think we'll get into today, and try to make it as entertaining and digestible as possible, because it's a crazy industry in and of itself. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And I know the last 2 days of panels have been great. So excited for this one as well.
Well, that is the perfect segue. So we're first going to start with how regulation actually works. We're going to try to demystify this process for you because it's few people kind of really understand how regulation moves from the idea to enforcement. So you have the legislators, obviously, who write the statutes. You have the agencies that interpret those statutes. You have enforcement bodies that apply them, and you have the courts, which is where I get involved, that resolve those disputes. And capital markets, they function inside these structured systems. Bitcoin's not outside those systems. It's being integrated into them. And that integration can sometimes feel volatile, but historically, this is how disruptive technologies normalize. Haley, if you don't mind going first, I think you could probably kick us off and just really like simply give the audience a 101 overview of the different US regulatory bodies, like FinCEN, CFTC, and I don't want to assume everyone knows what these stand for. So Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the SEC, Securities and Exchange, Office of Controller of Currency, the COC or the OCC. You probably know a lot more. If you could kick this off there, that'd be great.
Yeah, I do think it's important to start with like sort of the level 101 because you hear different, guidance coming out from different agencies, different enforcement actions, and there's a lot of these acronyms that get thrown around. But the way I really think about it is sort of three buckets. The first is the financial aspect of what Bitcoin is. So if you think of Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer, mechanism, what form of payment, that's when regulators like FinCEN and OFAC come into play. So FinCEN is concerned with anti-money laundering. They're concerned with know your customer. They don't want companies like Coinbase to be facilitating, accepting dollars, exchanging funds, and not knowing who they're doing that on behalf of. So it's this whole thing of fighting money laundering and terrorist financing. OFAC is another regulatory agency also under the Department of Treasury that is more focused on, countering terrorist activity. They maintain a list of actually individuals who you cannot facilitate a transaction on behalf of. It's called the SDN list. So if you think about these companies in this space, they need to know who their customers are. They need to ensure that someone is not on the SDN list, that they're not facilitating money transmission on behalf of individuals they shouldn't be supporting. And so those are kind of the two main regulators in that space. Then we have the IRS, which instead of viewing Bitcoin as money, they view it as property. And I actually saw a Q&A come in about Bitcoin moving from a currency versus property. And we can get to those questions at the end. But obviously the IRS wants to define Bitcoin as property so that it can tax Bitcoin as heavily as possible. And that includes any exchanges between different cryptocurrencies or the sale of Bitcoin being taxed and you paying capital gains tax on those. The next bucket is this sort of money transmission on the state or federal level. And so for many years, companies were getting money transmitter licenses in every state in order to actually operate as an exchange in those states where they had users. And so it's not only does a company like Coinbase need to register with FinCEN as a money services business and deal with anti-money laundering, they then need to worry about a state-by-state money transmitter license regime, which is what I've helped clients with, just dealing with all of these various regulators. More recently, and I think we'll get into this more later, but as the change of administration has occurred, there's also been a lot more focus on the federal level under the OCC, the Office of Controller of Currency, that regulates, national trust charters, national bank charters, and there has been a clear path for companies to go that route instead of this kind of hectic 50-state money transmitter license regime. So those are two additional regulators that companies are determining, how to comply with if what they're doing requires that sort of licensure and regulatory compliance. And the final bucket is what I talk about in terms of the SEC and the CFTC. That is something that is very interesting and has also been evolving under this current administration. But if you think about it, the SEC regulates any assets or cryptocurrencies that are considered a security, whereas the CFTC oversees commodities and derivative markets. The only thing the SEC and CFTC have kind of agreed with from the beginning is that Bitcoin is a commodity. And so it's regulated under the CFTC. There can't be market manipulation, that sort of thing. All the other cryptocurrencies sometimes fall within the SEC's realm. The SEC is still pertinent if you're just focused on Bitcoin because they oversee things like the Bitcoin spot ETFs, Some Bitcoin lending type products are regulated as sort of a securities offering. And we're also seeing this big trend of publicly traded companies embracing Bitcoin treasuries. And so obviously those companies have to comply with the SEC as publicly traded companies. So that is a lot of information, but it is sort of demonstrated of just how the US doesn't have one prudential regulator. So when companies are trying to figure out how to launch in the US, you have to go through this whole analysis of what you're doing, what you're offering, and as a result, what regulation sort of applies. And so I'd say that that's sort of the most noteworthy thing about the United States is that we don't have just one regulator that companies can go to for guidance. Lawyers like Paula and I are very busy because companies are trying to figure out how to launch and do things the right way. And it's definitely a very complicated landscape.
Right. Yeah. Do you, could we have a lot of newcomers too that are listening in, and individuals, not necessarily businesses, just everyday holders. Is there, in your experience, a good way for these particular people to develop any kind of regulatory literacy without feeling like they need to become like policy experts in each of these regulatory bodies?
Yeah, it's you know, through the years I've definitely compiled sort of like a great list of people I follow on Twitter. There's a lot of sort of legal thought leaders in the industry. You know, Twitter offers this world where you can actually hear firsthand from the chief legal officer of Coinbase about what they're dealing with, or the CEOs of companies. I also, you know, definitely there's some sort of 101 level materials through Bitcoin Magazine or CoinDesk. And so those are sort of where I point people to. But it takes time too. I mean, I think just starting to understand how money is regulated, and how Bitcoin is regulated, it kind of gives you that initial understanding of all those regulatory agencies and then the things that they're doing in the space that make headline news.
Right. And Lauren, when you were thrown into this, in your experience, did you feel like you relied on any kind of particular, um, someone on X or anyone else that you relied upon to develop your regulatory literacy among all the other work and jobs and other responsibilities everyone has on their plate? What did you turn to?
I would say, for the average holder user of Bitcoin, not to get overwhelmed, right, with jumping into this deep bucket of regulation, and just start where you're at, right? Just like Bitcoin, start where you're at. I think following both of you or other women that have been on this panel, like that's a great resource to get kind of the truth and level-headed perspective. There's also, other, you can go to the source. You discussed some of those bodies, whether it be the IRS for the US or the European Securities Markets and Authority regulator, or whatever their regulator is in the country. They're going to have information for you to not get overwhelmed, that kind of applies to what you're looking at. And then also for the US, there's institutions like the Bitcoin Policy Institute, that they're helping to even educate the lawmakers on how they should be regulating this. So you kind of get a front seat perspective from following them. And then further, if you want to dive a little bit deeper, I know law firms such as Latham and Watkins, they have a free US crypto policy tracker. So if you really want to do a deep dive and become someone knowledgeable like Haley, like you can get kind of that level of insight of what's going on. But taking it bit by bit, meeting yourself where you're at, I think is probably the best advice.
That's
great
a
advice.
great
Yeah.
call out with the working groups like the Blockchain Association, Coin Center. I mean, they're doing so much work in the space. So that's a really great call out too, because they, their websites oftentimes offer guidance, or you can just see the opinions that they're submitting on different legislation or litigation happening in the space, and why they think, the regulators are getting it wrong oftentimes. So that's insightful.
Yeah, they're great. Okay, so it sounds like we have an idea of the structure and real world application for everyday holders. we need to kind of get a baseline of what's actually changed recently. So from my perspective, representing miners, it's the agencies and the local governments that are trying to determine how does Bitcoin mining, how does data infrastructure growth interact with electricity markets. And this happens on the local level, state level, and the federal level. So there's not really been a regulatory collapse there. It's more about integration. And then, at the same time, we've seen institutional developments like ETF approvals that Haley was talking about that really signal increasing market acceptance. So the real question about what's really changing, it's become, what is the real structural change, or what is the narrative or agenda specific volatility that's going on? So Haley, we've heard a lot recently in the news about the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act of 2025. Just call it Clarity Act. For people who may only be hearing about that in the newspapers and in headlines, can you explain what exactly is this bill? So what's the Clarity Act trying to do? And what does it currently, where does it currently stand in our legislative process right now?
Yeah. So going back to when I was going over sort of high level, the different regulators in the industry, I would say that for the longest time, the big issue really was between the SEC and the CFTC. There was sort of this regulatory land grab happening where, besides Bitcoin being a commodity, it's sort of like, well, what are all these other cryptocurrencies? I know this is a Women of Bitcoin Summit, but this is sort of applicable to the entire cryptocurrency industry. And so the Clarity Act is really trying to have a more simple framework of who regulates what, when a certain protocol or token or project is within the jurisdiction of the SEC versus the CFTC. It also adds some registration and disclosure requirements, which I think would be helpful for the industry, because I mean, when you're talking about what we're actually seeing for the last, 8 years, we've seen regulation by enforcement action. We've seen the SEC and other regulators come into this space when the industry is asking for clarity, and the SEC instead comes at them with enforcement action saying, well, you didn't comply or do things the right way. Under the new administration, and once Gary Gensler left the SEC, that has changed dramatically. We haven't seen those issues, but the consumer protection and investor protection aspects are still there. They're still a concern, right? Because what we're really talking about at the end of the day is a new technology that is sort of a bank, sort of money, taking individuals' money. Sometimes people are investing and expecting a growth from their investment. So, even though there's less enforcement action, there still needs to be a good framework for people to be getting information from companies. And so that the Clarity Act would sort of solidify and clarify what the roles are, what the requirements are. It passed the House of Representatives last year, and it had bipartisan support, which is always a good thing to see, especially when it's something like Bitcoin that should be bipartisan. It needs to go through the Senate. And, the thing that I've been kind of tracking the last week is a lot of statements from the White House, from Trump, from Brian Armstrong at Coinbase, saying that they feel like the banks are intentionally stepping in and interfering with the progress of the Clarity Act, which has a few layers to it. But if you think about, any clarity and any additional institutional level embracement of Bitcoin, or even stable coins getting, interest and things like that, that would all be a positive for this industry and create a competitive advantage for this industry where banks don't want us to have that. So I think it'll be a really interesting, I don't know if it'll be weeks or months, but I see the conflict with the banks coming up again, and it'll be really interesting to see how the act progresses to finally get us that framework that we've been asking for as an industry.
Yeah, and Lauren, what about you? Do you think you can tell us about how any regulation directly impacted you and how those headlines played a role?
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is definitely bouncing off of a lot of what Haley's already kind of covered. But so Samourai Wallet, which my husband, Keone Rodriguez, and his partner and co-founder, William Hill, they started it in about 2015. And at that time, the regulator that the industry was relying on had put out, it is FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, had put out guidance in 2013 and then again reiterated it and kind of went deeper in 2019. So the whole time they were building their wallet, it was a Bitcoin wallet, had some additional privacy features. They were building it to stay within the guidelines put out by FinCEN. That kind of all changed for us in 2024. We were raided by the FBI at our home. There was a simultaneous raid on Bill and his wife in Portugal, and they were charged with 2 conspiracy charges, one being conspiracy to operate an unlicensed money service business, and the other being conspiracy to money launder. So both of those charges fall within the regulation of FinCEN. So we thought we were in compliance with. Through the course of our court case, it came about that 6 months prior to indictment, the DOJ had actually contacted FinCEN and said, hey, Samourai Wallet, do you think they are in violation of the money service business regulation? And FinCEN said, no, they don't take custody. According to us, we don't think they're in violation. This is, in my opinion, a clear example of regulation by prosecution. The regulator said one thing and even confirmed it with the DOJ, and the DOJ said, we don't care. So that's definitely affected me. Now, this doesn't apply, obviously, to holders or people using Bitcoin, but it is something that if you are building on Bitcoin, and especially something that's maybe pushing the limits, that you need to be aware of. Right, we are trying to fit this really cool technology that's so far kind of advanced, and build it, and then regulators are taking these square pegs that is Bitcoin and trying to force them into the round holes of existing regulation, and just understanding the fact that Bitcoin's a push versus a pull network, and there's just so many of these intricacies that really affect kind of understanding of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. The Clarity Act, which has some language still in it, I believe, from the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which kind of has some things in there to protect non-custodial builders, is really great. It's a great step forward. Does it go far enough? Probably not. Maybe not. I don't know. But it's a great first step, and that's things need to build from somewhere. So really happy to see that, and hopefully that does get through the Senate. As far as headlines, I think it's interesting as Bitcoiners, we kind of have this insight to when the news just gets something totally wrong. We say that's not how it works. And my experience from doing a court, this court thing was definitely eye-opening to that in a different context. That what's put out there, what the narrative is, does not necessarily mean it's true. And for some reason, we compartmentalize this, where we can see it when they get things totally wrong about Bitcoin, but we can't see it in other aspects where they might be just as wrong. It's just something we're not as knowledgeable about. So that's definitely been a growing aspect for me in this, is to, don't take things at face value, look a little bit deeper, get a second opinion if you see a headline. They're not always accurate.
Right. You really have to be a critical thinker with headlines in the news this day, with the abundance of news that's constantly coming out in the content. You really have to look at the motivations behind some of the headlines, really. Thank you so much for that really unique perspective that you brought to this panel. So parlaying off that, we're kind of we need to talk about how the individual holders what they should care about, and then we'll go into businesses and what businesses should be tracking. So going to just piggybacking off of what you just said, Lauren, how do you think individuals can develop calm, rational decision-making habits when this kind of policy uncertainty increases? What would you recommend, and what's your advice?
I would say first, don't stress. The United States, which has, I think, the most robust kind of regulation, or has put out the most rules in regards to Bitcoin, as well as most other countries. Bitcoin is perfectly legal as an individual to hold and use. So don't get scared of that. But you need to, when you are seeing things, because as we address, headlines can be scary and sensational, and so kind of be critical and curate where you're getting your sources, the facts you're getting your sources from. Excuse me, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. And just ignore the headlines. When people say that Bitcoin's crashing or it's going to become illegal, just take a step back. And yeah, I think that's probably best. Excuse me while I cough.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, no, Haley, can you jump in? What about you? What about the everyday retail investor?
Yeah,
not anyone. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, I wanted to just piggyback on what Lauren was saying and what we were talking about in terms of sensationalized headlines. I mean, it's funny because sometimes it's pretty transparent. Like if you take Elizabeth Warren, for example, she has the anti-crypto army. Like she's not trying to hide her feelings about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And so it creates these false narratives of like only illicit actors use Bitcoin, or it's used more for illicit activity than dollars, or people who are self-custodying are all doing it because they don't want to pay taxes. And so there becomes these false narratives that, I mean, I think people in the industry see it as part of their job to debunk those things and explain why that's not true. But yeah, people love to say that Bitcoin's dead or it's going to become illegal. But as it's become more adopted, institutionalized, Bitcoin ETFs, like holding Bitcoin in your, retirement accounts, like there's no going back from it. So I think to just keep that in mind. The two things from my experience when I was at Brown Rudnick, it was public information that we represented the unsecured creditors of BlockFi. And so the two things that I really tell people is just the everyday holder of Bitcoin is, for one, to understand the tax reporting. There's been talks about Trump trying to make something like de minimis exemption or something so that small daily use of Bitcoin wouldn't be taxed in the same way. But for right now, it's still taxed as capital gains. And I think that that's one of the complexities of self-custody, is that you don't have an intermediary to like give you your tax report at the end of the year. If you've sold or transacted in Bitcoin a lot, it's up to you to, have those records to be able to file your taxes. The second thing, in terms of the bankruptcy that we saw a few years ago, it has been a few years. I feel like it's in everyone's rearview mirror happily. Some people are still dealing with the fallout of FTX and that sort of thing. But from that really came where we saw another area of law that is not as advanced as crypto is, in the sense that the bankruptcy code still very much treats these companies and exchanges not as banks, as a company that if they file for bankruptcy, they, all the users who had money in these platforms become unsecured creditors. And so I think that that's just a good thing to kind of always keep in mind, is that, the reason self-custody is important is that it does remove the risk of an intermediary going bankrupt. In those bankruptcies, most users became unsecured creditors. They, got 30 cents on the dollar for any funds they had in the platform. And most of the platforms liquidated the Bitcoin on the date of the bankruptcy. So you're not even talking about, oh, well, at least I get 30% of my Bitcoin back. You're talking about 30% of the dollar value of the Bitcoin at the time. So, the whole idea in Bitcoin is to buy and hold forever or as long as, you can. And when a company goes bankrupt, it gets to decide to liquidate your assets for you. So, it's not like a pleasant topic, but I think it is good for people to just keep in mind, because I think many people were very surprised at becoming an unsecured creditor, because they were like, those were my funds in there. I shouldn't, I didn't mean to give them title or have them sort of take control of it. So just something for, I think that's another area of law that has a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Can you imagine getting that news?
No.
So what about, let's move on to businesses. We've talked about individuals and some blind spots, and that people should really keep in mind when they're self-custody and tax reporting, that Haley and Lauren provided her like personal experience there. But for businesses, what should businesses track? And all the businesses operating the space, like the regulatory clarity becomes a real strategic advantage for these businesses. And I know in the cases that I've handled involving Bitcoin mining operations, the issues often arise at multiple levels simultaneously. So that's like the federal regulatory framework, the state energy policy, the local zoning, and infrastructure regulations there. But so miners, for example, are interacting with electricity markets, land use laws, environmental frameworks, and a lot of local politics, and the media as well. So increasingly, we're seeing conversations around data centers bringing their own energy infrastructure to support large computing loads. I'm sure everyone's seen that in the news. So jurisdictional clarity, where and how you build, really matters enormously if you are on the mining and energy side. But Haley, on your perspective and your experience for companies that have been building in this Bitcoin space, or custodians, or those anywhere in the financial services departments, what should they be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I mean, when I worked in private practice, oftentimes I would tell clients, like, start from the beginning. Like, what are you trying to accomplish, and what is the best way to accomplish that, actually get that product to market? Because sometimes clients want to do 20 things at once, and you're like, well, as you do that, you're involving a lot more regulatory risk and regulatory agencies. So if a company has decided, I saw a question in the Q&A about if we're just focusing on US law. I have a little bit of exposure to other areas, but the main thing I'd say is that when we had regulation by enforcement, the big thing that was happening that was upsetting for the US is that companies were leaving the United States and going to jurisdictions that didn't have as crazy of a regulatory environment, or any requirements, to be honest. But if you are launching or operating here, a business really needs to understand, are you in the flow of funds? Are you taking dollars? Are you exchanging? Are you custodying? Or is there a way, even like Samourai, where you try to create a product that is outside of those regulated areas? And there's ways to do it. And I think now that enforcement are lower, the risk is also lower, in that you can try to, find the, and when I say gray area, I don't mean that in like a sneaky way. You can find ways to build products where they are not, regulated exchanges. But a lot of companies actually embrace the regulatory framework as sort of a regulatory moat, right? Because if you just go get the licenses, go through all the pain of that, you kind of have already proven and can stand the test of time to just expand and grow aggressively in the United States. So, if you think about companies like Coinbase and Gemini and, Bitcoin only exchanges that have just once and for all gone and gotten their licenses, set up an anti-money laundering program, brought in a chief compliance officer, they now kind of have a regulatory moat to continue to grow and compete in the industry. So, it's really up to a company what they're wanting to do, but it's definitely smart to, from the very beginning, figure out how the company is formed, how you're handling taxes, and then what you're actually doing business activity wise, and where you need to build out a compliance program to comply with that. So that's what I mainly see, is just companies trying to figure out how to start day one.
Right. And Lauren, for developers and entrepreneurs who are building privacy tools or infrastructure like that, what does the Samourai case signal about how regulators, or in your opinion, in your experience going through that? So how do you think, what's your advice on how regulators may approach software development going forward?
So firstly, I think like when Keone, husband and I got into Bitcoin and they kind of started Samourai, right? It was the Wild West. It was still magical internet money. And there was a lot of fun in that, but it is serious business now, and the regulators have come in, and like Haley said, there's a lot of things that you need to consider. If you are a builder, or if you're thinking about building something new and innovative, get legal advice. We did have an attorney. Samourai Wallet did have an attorney, and them and us thought that we were in compliance. Clearly we weren't. I think one of the things Keone said, which is kind of a bit of a downer, but not applicable necessarily, and like we're in a good spot currently with this administration being pro Bitcoin, but that can change. One of the things he wishes they would have done is to put a big retainer at a criminal defense firm, because we were banned from using Bitcoin during, and that's really what he believed in it fully. Like we've been living off of Bitcoin for since about 2013. So, it's a long time, and that's really where it was. So yeah, if you're going to do something that's getting close to that line, get a defense team in place just in case. Hopefully you won't have to use them. The biggest thing I think, and this is Summit's clearly helping with it, the work that a lot of policy groups are doing, it's changing hearts and minds about it. You mentioned Senator Warren earlier, and her push, and everything's terrorists and this and that, and then you also have those people in the judiciary. He wasn't our judge in our case, but a judge in the Southern District of New York, which is where our case was brought. Judge Radkoff said cryptocurrencies currently serve no positive purpose other than providing a platform for fraud and crime. So those are people's attitudes. The FATF, which is the Financial Actions Task Force, which is a G7, multi-governmental agency, had a report lately, claiming peer-to-peer transactions are used, for money laundering and terrorist finances and this and that. And so that's the attitude that's out there. But summits like this and other interactions that really say, no, we're normal people using it because it's better money, because, all the promises of Bitcoin that it does meet. That's really what's valuable, I think, in changing those perspectives and hopefully stopping future regulation by prosecution along those lines. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your perspective on that. We're coming towards the end, and I definitely want to leave some time for questions. So our last area that we wanted to cover was just, how do you stay informed without fear? So I might have to do more of like a lightning round where we do like just one short answer. Each one of you, quick, brief answer to a question, the last question about fear. There's a lot of volatility in headlines, right? So how do we personally stay informed without reacting emotionally to every regulatory development or any kind of political cycle based on who the current administration is in place? Haley, you want to go first?
Yeah. I try to think of the regulatory developments and like headline news the same as I do the price of Bitcoin. I think of a long time horizon. So, unless there's a full, crackdown through legislation on Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, this is all just sort of the growing pains of a new technology and a new industry. So really just kind of focusing on incrementally, like taking a step back, what institutions are doing and accomplishing in the space continues to move in a very positive direction. But I think Lauren made a great point that, there being less regulatory enforcement is great. That may not always be the case. There could be another change of administration, and the climate goes back to sort of negative sentiment. And so I think for users and for companies, like, the priority just needs to be in consumer protection at its core, regardless. I mean, just making sure that the products that you're offering are just good for the industry as a whole needs to be kind of the benchmark.
And Lauren, I hate to cut you off. I kind of wanted to get to at least maybe one question. If we have time here, we have like 4 minutes. So let's see. Can we bring the highest voted question to the top? Let's see here. Oh yeah, that was the question that Haley was going to come back to. Haley, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I find it, Trump has made statements regarding what I mentioned, like a de minimis tax exception, or just getting rid of capital gains entirely. All these regulatory agencies are incentivized to want to regulate and benefit financially from Bitcoin, and not just say, oh, it's currency, not property. I think that eventually it will become currency, especially as we continue to mature, and maybe the volatility reduces a bit more. But I'm not sure in the United States if the IRS will. I think it'll be a long road and a long battle to get them to see it that way.
And then we may have time for one last question.
I saw one about Kraken, which is interesting. Let me see.
Oh, there it is.
There's a lot of questions. Oh, yeah. So I tweeted about this yesterday, but I actually think that Kraken. So if you think about it, that if you take Kraken, for example, they're in a world where they had, state by state money transmitter licenses. They went down the sort of banking route. And then them and other companies were having trouble actually getting access to the Fed and a master account, which is really one of the big benefits of being a bank, is that not just how you're regulated in terms of your exchange of dollars to Bitcoin, but how people are actually getting Bitcoin on your platform. I mean, right now, companies in the Bitcoin space need to have banking partners. I mentioned I started my career at Silvergate Bank. They were a partner to Bitcoin companies because it's difficult for Bitcoin companies to get bank accounts. So this allows, Kraken to sort of have more wide range of services they can offer without relying on an intermediary bank, including wires and ACH. So we're just moving towards a place where these platforms will really be sort of an all-in-one platform. And so I think yesterday's news about Kraken was really big.
Thank you so much, Haley. Thank you so much, Lauren, for the valuable insight you provided today. I am so sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but you know where to find us. We're on X, LinkedIn, all social media platforms. We'd love to hear from everyone. This has been a remarkable day. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us toward the very end of this 2-day summit. Our panel is complete, so please go ahead, select the Join Now button, and that'll bring you back into the main stage for the big closing celebrations. Thank you all so much. Bye.